What's going on, patrons? This is Adi, and I'm back with another Patreon exclusive for Thirtus International. This time, I'm here to talk to you guys about Jose Luis Mendilibar and some of the changes that we currently see in regards to the pressing scheme. As you guys know, things have not quite been the same this year under Jose Luis Mendilibar, and there's multiple reasons for this. From the profile of the personnel that have been brought in and to the personnel that even left, as well as just the differences between the performances of those who are here. So, we're going to start by doing a little bit of a recap of the press under Mendilibar. Now, if you remember from the initial tactical analysis I did last season, the press begins with the forward, in this case, Ayub El Kabi, the number 9, and our number 10, initiating the press. In a restart situation, it's generally El Kabi making the initial run while Chiquinho runs towards the other center back or the deeper midfielder in order to force the ball to the wide areas. The wingers are then supposed to close down those areas where the fullbacks are. And the idea is that when they press forward, they are going to force the fullbacks to then play the ball towards the middle. Now, if you look at the chart that I have here, I have a big blue circle. That is where we are setting what we have called on this show the press trap. So the fullback in this case, or the winger, the winger is moving forward. He's pressuring the fullback, forcing the fullback to try and play the ball right there in the middle where the midfielder should be stepping in. The fullback is also pulling up as well in order to cover and also provide support to the winger on the side there. Now, the whole purpose of this system is to force that ball into the midfield area, like I said before. The central midfielders, in this case, you have Muzakitis on the left, or on the right, it would be Santiago Heze. They have to be able to anticipate the ball and the direction that it's going. So then they can then lay the trap, recover the ball, and then create a counter opportunity for Olympiacos. So for much of the season, the press has been pretty disorganized and less effective. We have seen the press trap fail on many occasions due to an imbalance here. Unfortunately, besides Santiago Eze, no one else has been able to competently provide balance on the other side of the pitch. Now, if you guys remember, we had a similar issue just like this during the decline under Diego Martinez right before he was fired. Santiago Eze was just running all over the place, covering so much ground, and he didn't have a partner that he trusted that could cover the other side. In the second half of the season, when Mendilibar arrived, we saw Santiago Eze pair with Ibora, especially in Europe, and there was a much better balance in the midfield. Ibora was much better at positioning, and he was great at closing down passing lanes. He was also just a mammoth of a man, so he could help in a lot of these dead ball situations. Now, this season, we have experienced some of those previous issues. Danny Garcia, Stamenic, and Muzakitis just aren't great partners in this aspect. And overall, this has impacted the press itself, not in its intensity necessarily, but in its overall effectiveness. Now, I believe personally that Muzakitis can get to the point where he's acting more and more in a better fashion and in terms of anticipation. But he's got a little bit of time to go. He's only 17 years old. So there's quite a few things that need to be solved here. Now, let's start off by having a look at our pressing intensity so far this season. Now, this chart, for those of you that haven't seen one of many charts like this that we've posted on social media, this is a chart that measures our pressing intensity. And what we did was we separated the performances from Greece and Europe so that you could kind of see how things have been different. And in this line, you'll see in 15-minute intervals on average how we have approached these matches in terms of an intensity factor. So the more passes you allow in between defensive actions, this determines what pressing intensity is. We call this PPDA, or passes allowed per defensive action. So the more passes you allow, the higher the number is, the more relaxed the press is. The less passes you allow, so the lower the number is, the more intense your press is. So now, in the case of the chart, the higher the line, the less intense the press. The lower the line, the more intense the press. To make it simple. So this year, we've seen in Greece that we're starting off our matches with a more intense press while we let up the press in the end of the first half. We increase intensity towards the end of the second half. Last year, we started off matches lighter in the press, working into the game, and then we increased the intensity of the press towards the end of the first half. Then in the second half of last year's Greece performances, we're talking about since Mendilibar arrived, we would start off high intensity in the second half, and then we would dial it back as the half wore on. In Europe, we see something a little bit different. In Europe, this year, our press starts off more intense than it did when Mendilibar arrived last year. But the transition of the pressing intensity has changed slightly. This year, we start the second half off strong in Europe, and then we end strong with a little bit of a more chaotic change or relaxing change in the middle of the second half. Some of this has to do with subs or the lack thereof with Mendilibar, which sees us kind of lose momentum in that aspect. But the transition has changed from what we saw last year, which was last year the performances in the second half were kind of the opposite. We would start off light and end light, but then we would have in the middle interval a really stepped up press. Some of that had to do with substitutions, but the way we approach the second half has been completely different in Europe this year than it was last season. Now, if we look at how this has materialized in terms of our defensive actions, we see a couple of differences as well. So in Greece, which we have the stats up for here, what we did was we just kind of took some of the average per match, per 90 minutes per match defensive stats, and we kind of just stacked them right next to each other. So on the right, you have this year, on the left, you have last year. In Greece, we see that while we're allowing less opportunities so far on our goal, we do engage in overall less defensive actions, but with actually some greater success, allowing fewer entries into our final third. The only problem is that the imbalance in our midfield has allowed much greater chances in terms of shot quality as we measure an XG per shot than we allowed last year. Another weird issue has been that we are eating goals despite the fact that our XGOT, our post shot XG, is lower than our overall expected goals allowed, our XGA. So our post shot XG, this is a measure of finishing quality. So the finishing against us has not been spectacular, contrary to popular belief. And this indicates that either Tsolakis' positioning is not great or we just have been incredibly unlucky. Now, in Europe, we're seeing some of the opposite trends. And I'll show you the next slide over here. So we have improved efficiency in ball winning and also in terms of the number of duels and success. But the problem is that we've allowed more successful transitions into our final third on average than when Mendilibar first arrived. And this is due to some of the same reasons as what kind of plagues our press in Greece. An imbalance in our midfield is creating dangerous opportunities on the counter against us, especially up the middle and when one of our fullbacks gets caught a little bit too far forward. So, how does Mendilibar fix this? Mendilibar fix issues that are plaguing us despite improving some aspects of the system. On the pressing side, we're just off pace in some ways compared to last year. But if we look at our individual data, we see that first Chiquinho is not quite the same as he was last year. Less successful actions almost in all respects, both in Greece and in Europe. Santiago Eze is actually doing more than what he did last season, but it's not enough if he doesn't have the right balance. We saw this last year as well. So if Chiquinho is doing less, it doesn't really matter if Eze picks up more because Eze can't do it all himself. And and Muzakitis, as I mentioned earlier, is not completely in tune with the midfield press and trap. He's provided us a better creativity from deep, lovely vision, and can split the lines against the defense. But he's not super successful in the press trap. At the same time, our fullback balance and commitment to the press has also not really been the same or the most consistent. Now, some of this has been because Ortega just has not been good at all this year. I mean, some of his weaknesses are just really on display again in this season. Hasn't been good defensively. And then the failure of the defensive unit to work off of each other and the press and the midfield has just provided a lot of really, really strong counter opportunities against us. So, in the end, really, we have a very nuanced set of solutions that Jose Luis Mendilibar can take or try to take. And first, it has to do with Garcia and Stamenic. If we cannot assimilate these two defensive mids, then in the short term, we need to use more of Andreas Doy, who looked great in preseason at the number 6 position. Bakulas as well. We need to use him, his energy. And in the short term, those options are better for us, especially in Greece. And then when we get to January, maybe we get a better option in the market. We get rid of Stamenic, we get rid of Garcia, and we bring in somebody else and see how that works. In Greece, though, we really also need to consider that maybe instead of using multiple defensive midfielders, we should be using a more offensive asset like Sergio Oliveira. When Sergio Oliveira played in the deeper midfield position, we saw a lot better from the team. Oliveira can move the ball better. He can be a big presence in the box. He has a great long shot. And given that we need to put our chances away in these situations so that we don't get punished by one of the 2 or 3 counters or situations we allow by these mid and lower table teams per match, you need somebody like that to really help you out here. So in Greece, the answer is twofold. You get a better position in the market, you find somebody else, you get rid of Stamenic and Garcia if they really cannot do this for you. You, in the short term, use a guy like Doy who's looked better than any of them have. You use Bakulas, whose energy and, quite frankly, his ability to get forward is something that we need as well from deeper in the pitch. Or you use somebody like Oliveira. In Greece, the context is so much different than what we see in Europe. In Europe, we're given space. Teams are playing us more openly, so the system is more effective. It doesn't look like there's as many holes. Even though there are some holes, as we discussed before, the system works better. But we're going to get punished by better teams in Europe if we're not a lot more effective. It's hard to rely on a 17-year-old kid to be as good in the press as Ibora was last season, even if he does offer us as many things as he does. But in Greece, I don't necessarily believe that the answer is for us to get more defensive. We need more energy, and we need somebody that's better for us on the ball from deep. So I think in the end, the solution for Mendilibar here, if you want to see a better press, use individuals with better energy or use somebody that can do more for you in possession. In this case, Sergio Oliveira, when somebody like Muzakitis isn't available for you. So I hope that this gave you guys a little bit more insight into the pressing scheme and how some things have changed. With Mendilibar, the tactics don't change. So we're not going to expect or even try to think out different types of tactics that will be used because that's not the case. Mendilibar just changes people. So if we're looking at this and thinking about what people can make the situation better, there are solutions. If we cannot find a solution to fix from individuals that are available, then the consideration has to be made about Mendilibar and the tactics that he uses because he's not going to change. So if you don't like the tactics that are being used, you have to change the coach. I'm not going to advocate for that because I think Mendilibar is the right guy for us. There's just the decisions about what players to use. So I hope you guys enjoyed the latest Patreon analysis. If you have any questions, you know where to find me. And until next time, this is the Dos International by the fans for the fans.